Two words on this presentation. It's the confluence of two research projects, one that I have coordinated as a PI until a couple of years ago, and a PhD dissertation that will be defended this year by Alessandro Colombo. Alessandro apologizes because he could not participate to the event, and I apologize for not being Alessandro. All the interesting stuff about Cova da Moura that you will hear today come from his work, so it will be better for you to have him rather than me. But anyway, the presentation focuses on the informal neighborhood, the informal settlement of Cova da Moura, located in Amadora, right outside the city limits of Lisbon, Portugal. And I'll try to show how this informal settlement has passed through different rounds of public intervention. And in the end, I'll make a few observations about what we can learn from this story. But first, a little bit of context. I wanted to tell you a few things about the context in which these investigations have been conducted in the last 5 years. That is the context of a resurgence of housing issues in post-austerity Lisbon, but I think I'll skip it, so we can maybe discuss it later if it's any of interest, of any interest for you. But the main thing is, if you don't know, before COVID, Lisbon was suffering from a severe housing crisis. And that eventually got the attention of a lot of people, activists, politicians, academics, etc., etc. More important, the context in which the history of Cova da Moura has developed, okay? And therefore the historical trajectory of housing informality as a policy issue in Portugal. Very briefly, in the early 80s, a severe housing crisis, another one, had developed in the metropolitan area of Lisbon, which resulted in a boom of informal settlements. This crisis has started to build up in the 50s and the 60s with the increase of flows of migrants from the countryside. And in the second half of the 70s, this urban pressure increased following the process of decolonization. From former Portuguese colonies came an inflow of hundreds of thousands of retornados, that is, white Portuguese settlers, and Black immigrants, Lusophone immigrants, okay? And throughout this period, public policy was completely unable to provide an adequate response to this solution, adequate housing opportunities specifically. Things started to change in the late 80s, so housing informality became the object of several different programs, one of which probably represents the last major housing program, rehousing program implemented in Western Europe. It's the special program for rehousing, Programa Especial de Realojamento, or PER. And to give you an idea, PER operations in the metropolitan area of Lisbon involved the rehousing of 130,000 residents out of a total population of a little more than a couple of million. So it was a major program. And it is important to stress here that what we're discussing is a specific form, a specific sanctioned form of urban informality. That is, we're talking about people who built their homes on someone else's property, okay? It's not a matter of licensing, land use regulation, it's squatting and self-construction, okay? And here you see a map reproducing the situation of the early 90s in the eyes of the PER, if you want. A 1993 survey of the Barracas in the area of Lisbon. The gray areas are the 19 municipalities of the Lisbon metropolitan area. And the Barracas were concentrated in the northern region of the metropolitan area, north of the river, the Tejo. And 4 municipalities specifically hosted about 70% of this big mass of people, okay? Lisbon, Amadora, Loures, and Oeiras. And we're interested here in one of them, Amadora, the red circle in the map. Amadora is an autonomous municipality right outside Lisbon, and it counts today some 180,000 residents. And Amadora is where Cova da Moura is located. It represented, Amadora, the territory of Amadora represented at the time of the PER one of the areas that were most affected by the plague of the Barracas, as it was called at the time, okay? It's a small municipality, is relatively poor, with several thousands of barracas and very little land available for any kind of development. So what are the key elements of the PER? Based on this survey of the population, the government gave money to the municipalities, which could then buy or build, mostly build, new public housing. Then the municipality would move the population surveyed by the PER in new social public housing estates and raise the barracas to the ground. Quite a straightforward program, okay? Definitely an old-fashioned one. I think that these programs were very much used in Western Europe in the 50s and the 60s, but not so much in the 90s or the early 2000s. So the result is something like this, okay? Hundreds of rehousing fluxes, moving people from informal settlements to public housing projects. And this is the atlas that we have compiled for the PER, in case you're interested. But this is not the story for today. The story for today is the case of Cova da Moura, Amadora. Speaking of which, this is the part of where Alessandro's work starts. So the main source here is Alessandro's study in urban governance of Cova da Moura. And so what is Cova da Moura? Cova da Moura is an informal settlement. It is exactly part of that historical trajectory that I have just described to you. It was established in the mid-70s on private land by, once again, retornados and Lusophone Black immigrants, especially from Cabo Verde. And by the early 90s, it had grown to be one of the largest informal settlements in the metropolitan area. And two factors, however, make Cova da Moura a peculiar case in the general context that I have described. First, the existence since the early 80s, the mid-70s really, of strong local associations, and especially the umbrella of this association, the Comissão do Bairro, that is the neighborhood commission. And second, and this is not a situation that was present in all the settlements, even the big settlements, okay, at the time. And second, the history of Cova da Moura is a history of an exception. It is, in fact, the only large settlements excluded by rehousing operations under the PER, okay? So the exceptional things in many ways is that Cova da Moura is still here, okay? It counts today 7,000 residents, and you can see it here. The aerial picture clearly betrays the informal origins of the neighborhood. Sorry, I live in a noisy area, and these origins are also reflected in several planning and housing issues. For example, most typically overcrowded in Cova da Moura is a problem. And but most importantly, these origins are also reflected in a decade-long planning impasse. So Cova da Moura is still technically an illegal settlement built on private land for which no detailed plan exists. So that every single house built there is illegal because there's no license. And here you can get a glimpse of the status of Cova da Moura in the local news cycle. Okay, so this is Google Portugal. I've looked for Cova da Moura for images. And the red circles are the news about violence and or police in Cova da Moura. This is just to give you an idea. I'm not implying that Cova da Moura is worse than other locations in the metropolitan area. Maybe it's just more famous, but this is it. Few more pictures. This is one of the local NGOs, the Moinho da Juventude, Cova da Moura, more Cova da Moura. This is Tupac. And so this to just give you some visuals. But the thing here is, how can we discuss governance of Cova da Moura? In this presentation, we use the concept of decentered governance to describe, if I can put it like this, more how the city works rather than to refer to any technique or methodology to make the city work, to govern the city. Okay, So governance is here the concept that describes the process of collective problem solving in a complex way. Yeah, so any system of governance in this definition emerges from a number of different key factors: the geography of the actors which are involved in collective decision-making, their identity, their mutual relations, the spatial, historical, and social context in which decision-making take place, and a vast repertoire of actions, which includes plans and positive actions, but also omissions, for example, ordinary routines and practices, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, the collective problem solving is a cumulative process, both in the sense of institutional and organizational learning, and because governance emerges through the stratification of the subsequent policy eras, okay? There are several scholars that I could quote, but I guess that the best metaphor of the concept of decentered governance in this respect is Abdulmalik Simoni's idea of people as infrastructure that you probably are familiar with. So the idea that the ordinary lives of the people, among many other things, contribute to build and to govern our city. This means that what counts is not simply the system of formal rules governing a policy sector, but rather the stratification of subsequent rounds of interactions between all the actors involved. So let's look at Cova da Moura in this light. And okay, I think I am on time, I think. Let's look at Cova da Moura, thinking about decentered governance, so that we can single out a few elements in this emergent process of governance of Cova da Moura. These are the things that I think, in a very straightforward way, one should keep in mind in order to understand how Cova da Moura has worked and evolved in the last 4 decades. And so first and most obviously, its origin as a self-built neighbor. This is the origin of the conflict on the land that continues to this day, because it's located on private property, blah, 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 no detailed plan, every construction is illegal, and so on and so forth. But the original community also found effective forms of self-organization from the very start. An official neighborhood committee, alongside some very strong local NGOs. Okay. And I don't want to romanticize, and I think we should always keep in mind that we should not equate the residents with the association or the residents with the representatives. But my emphasis here is on the fact that local forms of organization in Cova da Moura have always been effective and recognized. Okay, and also on this basis, it developed a sort of understanding between the residents and the municipality. So, for example, the residents pay property taxes and utilities. The municipality runs schools in Cova da Moura, provide road maintenance, take care of the cleaning, etc., etc. So public authorities have relations with local organizations and the local residents in many ways, through many different channels, formal and otherwise. And finally, last but not least, Cova da Moura, one of the elements of these emergent governance is the fact that Cova da Moura passed through several eras of public policy. It was created by the lack of an effective public policy, housing policy specifically. Went through different generations of policy interventions, rehousing programs, social programs, urban regeneration programs, experienced the almost complete lack of investment in public housing that mark the last 20 years in Portugal in general. So as a local consequence of a general policy, okay? And of course, it will now be a test for more recent initiatives in the field of housing policy. And this is why the last important round of policy intervention in Cova da Moura, it's interesting, and it's the Marginal Neighborhoods Initiative, the Iniciativa Bairros, Críticos, EBC, 2005-2013. And I do not have time to go in depth here because I have 5 minutes, I think. But the IBC represented an interesting experiment that in the end went nowhere. Okay, the IBC was an urban regeneration program that was supposed to be the pilot for future initiatives on a broader scale. And the main concept was the following. Rather than supporting any specific policy action, the IBC was supposed to invest in local partnership. The central idea was to co-produce a strategy of intervention in the neighborhood with residents and local partners, and invest in creating a critical mass that would sustain local initiatives on a more continuative basis, even after the end of the project, I mean. And as I said, an interesting experiment that went nowhere, because to make a long story short, after the outbreak of the economic crisis 10 years ago, the government changed and the IBC was cut. And of course, it remained a pilot program rather than the blueprint for any broader policy strategy. The mention of the IBC, however, can introduce my last slide and very conclusive remarks. Okay, so I would like to present 3 final points about the case. First, there are a few practical lessons for governance to be drawn by the experience of Cova da Moura and IBC specifically. It's the stuff you might want to know if you're interested in making urban regeneration work, okay? And once again, I won't go into that. There are 3 points about policy integration, co-production, and the necessary and sufficient condition for policy success. But I will just be happy to say 2 things. One is that despite its abrupt end, the IBC produced a lot of food for thought in this respect. Even more than that, I would venture to say that the IBC marked the reflection of a whole generation of people in the policy community, in housing policy. Okay, so that this kind of impact outside also the community itself. And the other thing is that policymaking sometimes seems to be looking the other way and be perfectly able to ignore this kind of reflection, even if they are, you know, sort of consolidated in the local epistemic community or policy community, call it how you want. As far as it's possible to judge for the moment, for example, this new generation of housing policy that's been launched a few years ago is still looking in many ways to the pair as a policy model, rather than to the debate about the pair or the IBC or other paradigms to conceive urban intervention. And my 2 final points have to do with the broader lessons that we can learn from observing the process. Okay, about governance as an analytical concept, if you want, rather than a normative one. The first concerns the limits of governance design. What is the perimeter of governance process? Can it include all the relevant factors underlying the problem of a given area that you want to address? This is never the case, I think. But in observing Cova da Moura, one can see 3 clear examples in this respect. First, while a problematic mix of socioeconomic issues can be found in a specific urban area, the solutions to these issues often cannot be provided at the local level. Think about the dynamics of unemployment. So there are lots of unemployed in Cova da Moura. Are you going to do a project to create 2,000 jobs in Cova da Moura? It's of course not possible. So problems of the neighborhood are not the problems in the neighborhood, and there is a slight difference between, an important difference between the 2. Second, there are structural problems that are beyond the reach of co-production, so to speak. This is the case in Cova da Moura of land issues and land ownership, problems that prove to be impossible to address through that forum, okay? And third, the timeline for developing a good governance process does not necessarily coincide with the timeline of, say, administrative reform or the electoral cycles and so on and so forth, not to mention the impact of contingent events that can be exogenous even to the national system, economic crisis, COVID, the next generation EU, and so on and so forth. My final point is the following. If our concept of governance includes action but also the lack of it, what can we make of the non-solution of problems, of the problems of Cova da Moura, specifically the lack of any solution in relation to planning and land ownership? As I told you, Cova da Moura was never included in any rehousing program under the PER. And indeed, it was the only large settlement excluded by the PER. Do we know why? Not exactly. I think that this non-decision was the result of different factors. From the point of view of the municipality, Cova da Moura was yet another problem. There was little land to rehouse the residents of, and 40,000 barracas were already treated through the PER, okay? So it was a problem. For the association, rehousing would have meant resetting, because large settlements such as Cova da Moura could be unpacked to 10 or 20 different destinations, and so on and so forth. We don't know exactly why, but Cova da Moura was withdrawn from the PER. Okay, so the question is what we can make of this impasse. Is it a policy failure? Is it a failure of the PER? Is it a failure of the municipality, for example? Or is it a sort of consensual impasse? Okay, there are similar episodes, for example, described by James Olson in Sao Paulo, when eviction cases go to Brasilia. That is the expression. That is, the case gets buried into under tons of bureaucracy and paper, etc. And this informally sanctions the victory of the residents, because they are not going to be evicted anymore. What is certain is that the case of Cova da Moura is very different from the case of the so-called non-PER families, which were people, individuals that for different reasons came to be excluded by the program, okay? And maybe, yes, it's a consensual and even to a certain extent planned policy failure that suits all the interested and rationalities in that situation. So on the one side, and I'm closing, we need to look into the box to understand what has happened in Cova da Moura in this respect. But on the other is precisely looking into the box that helps you define what success can mean in this perspective. Thank you.